When Ukrainians see another apartment building destroyed, another family killed, or another city attacked, the question feels unavoidable. How could 140 million Russians allow this to happen? Why did they not stop Putin? Why did they not fill the streets, sabotage the war, overthrow the government, or at least speak openly against it? And if they did none of those things, does that make them collectively guilty? This is one of the most emotionally charged questions created by the war. It is also one of the hardest to discuss honestly because any attempt to introduce distinctions can sound like an excuse. So let me be clear from the beginning. I am not going to defend those who supported the invasion. I will not excuse propagandists who called for Ukrainian cities to be destroyed, informers who denounced their neighbors, officials who organized repression, soldiers who committed crimes, or people who turned the war into a profitable career. They made choices. They bear responsibility for those choices, but I also refuse to treat an entire population as one moral organism, as though a propagandist in Moscow, a frightened pensioner in a provincial town, a political prisoner, and a child born after the invasion all carry the same guilt. That may satisfy anger. It does not produce justice, and it may even help create the next war. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union. I grew up inside the Russian cultural and political system, and I have spent much of my life trying to understand how that system shapes human behavior. Today, I want to examine collective guilt without hiding behind slogans from either side. What could ordinary Russians realistically have done? How does dictatorship change the meaning of silence? Where does cowardice and complicity begin? Who bears the greatest responsibility, and what happens when moral judgment stops distinguishing between people who had vastly different knowledge, choices, opportunities, and power? Here's our roadmap. When emotion becomes judgment. Why moral outrage can clarify some things and distort others. The country without political agency. How Russian history separated the population from power. Why Russians do not revolt? What repression changes about responsibility? The guilty, the complicit, and the silent. Where I believe the moral lines should be drawn. The danger of collective blame. How indiscriminate condemnation can strengthen future nationalism. Choosing civilization. What justice should look like after the war. Please follow this show on Spotify. It helps the program reach people who may never encounter it on YouTube. And here, you can support the channel by subscribing, sharing the video, joining my think tank, or leaving a super thanks. Thank you for being here. Let's begin with the place where moral judgment often starts, and where it can go dangerously wrong: emotion. When emotion becomes judgment. Many people believe that the heart is the highest moral authority. They feel outrage, grief, disgust, or hatred and assume that the intensity of the feeling proves the accuracy of the judgment attached to it. But the voice of the heart is not the voice of perfect wisdom. It is often the voice of instinct. Human beings developed their emotional reactions long before they created courts, constitutions, historical research, or statistical analysis. Our instincts were formed in small communities where survival depended on recognizing threats quickly, protecting the group, obeying leaders during danger, and distrusting outsiders. Those instincts remain extremely powerful. They tell us that the world is divided into our people and the enemy. When our community is attacked, nuance feels like betrayal. Anyone who asks questions can appear to be weakening the tribe at the moment when unity seems most important. This mechanism had been exploited repeatedly. After the Reichstag fire in 1933, Hitler presented the event as proof that Germany faced an existential internal enemy. Fear helped him justify the destruction of political opposition. Many people accepted the repression because they believed something sacred. The nation itself was under attack. Putin used a similar emotional shortcut when he described Ukrainians as Nazis. For Russians, the Second World War is not simply history. It is the central sacred myth of the state. The Soviet victory over Nazi Germany is presented as the ultimate proof of Russian virtue, sacrifice, and greatness. Once Ukrainians were placed inside the category of Nazis, millions of people stopped asking what Ukraine had actually done. The emotional conclusion arrived first. Nazis are absolute evil, and absolute evil must be destroyed before it destroys us. The instinct is ancient. Outsiders are dangerous. Remove the outsiders and the tribe will be safe. But modern societies cannot be governed safely by Paleolithic instincts. Emotional reactions are valuable signals, but emotions cannot calculate policy. They cannot reliably determine individual guilt, predict long-term consequences, or build stable institutions. That requires reason. The question is not whether anger toward Russia is understandable. Of course it is. The question is what we want that anger to achieve. Do we want the immediate satisfaction of condemning the entire people? Or do we want to create the conditions under which Russia can no longer attack its neighbors? Those are not necessarily the same goal. The country without political agency. Before discussing the guilt of ordinary Russians, we must first examine how much influence they have historically possessed over the state. For most of Russian history, the answer is very little. The Tsar did not govern with the consent of his subjects. Ordinary people could influence power only through rare uprisings, military collapse, or revolution. There were no durable institutions through which society could restrain the ruler. No strong parliament existed for most of imperial history. Courts did not stand above the sovereign. Property rights remained weak, and local self-government was limited. This political structure developed alongside Russia's geography and economy. Across much of the country, agriculture was difficult. The growing season was short, the climate harsh, and many regions stood far from major international trade routes. Survival often depended on large-scale coordination controlled from above. The state collected resources, moved labor, organized armies, built roads, and imposed order across enormous distances. The individual mattered less than the collective structure to which he belonged. This produced a large empire, but not an independent citizenry. Most people were poor. They had few weapons, little property, and almost no ability to defend themselves against the authorities. The Russian Empire operated according to this formula for centuries. The Soviet Union reproduced it in a modernized form. Private wealth was almost eliminated. Employment, housing, education, pensions, travel, and professional advancement all depended on the state. A person who challenged the system did not merely risk losing an election or a promotion. He could lose his entire place in society. Putin's Russia restored private property, but it did not create secure political independence. Wealth exists, but it remains vulnerable to the state. A businessman may own a company until a politically connected official wants it. A journalist may work freely until her reporting crosses an invisible line. A governor may appear powerful while remaining entirely dependent on the Kremlin. Russia, therefore, has rich people but no independent centers of power. Ukraine developed differently. Its land was more fertile. Its links to European trade were stronger, and its political traditions included the Cossack idea of armed communities negotiating with authority rather than simply receiving commands from above. After independence, Ukraine inherited Soviet corruption and bureaucracy. But wealth and political influence remained more fragmented than in Putin's Russia. Different oligarchic groups competed. Regional elites had their own interests. Media outlets belonged to rival owners. Political coalitions changed. This system was corrupt, chaotic, and unfair, but fragmentation created room for political movement. No single ruler could easily monopolize every source of money, information, and force. That distinction is fundamental. Political independence depends not only on laws or ideas, but on whether people have resources the state cannot easily take away. Where income, information, and organization all depend on the authorities, political freedom remains fragile. Putin's system has spent years eliminating such independence and bringing every important sphere under centralized control. The invasion of Ukraine follows the same logic. Ukraine's very existence outside Moscow's authority, especially as a closely related, partly Russian-speaking society with a different political path, challenges the Kremlin's claim that no alternative is possible. Putin does not want only Ukrainian territory. He wants to destroy the example Ukraine represents. Why Russians do not revolt? When Ukrainians ask why Russians allowed this war, the question contains an assumption that the population had a realistic option to stop it and choose not to use it. But what exactly was that option? Should Russians have demonstrated? Many did. There were anti-war protests across Russia after the full-scale invasion began. People were detained for holding blank signs, for displaying the words "no to war," and even for quoting phrases associated with peace. The state deliberately made the price of public opposition disproportionate to its likely effect. This does not make protest meaningless. Moral witness matters, but heroism cannot become the minimum standard by which we judge every human being. People are not automatically guilty because they refuse to sacrifice their freedom, health, or lives in an action that had almost no chance of achieving its political goal. Belarus provides a useful example. In 2020, hundreds of thousands of Belarusians protested against the stolen election. The demonstrations were enormous, peaceful, and sustained. Workers went on strike. Women formed human chains. Entire neighborhoods resisted. The regime survived because the police and security services continued obeying Alexander Lukashenko. Protesters were beaten, tortured, imprisoned, dismissed from work, and driven into exile. The people had courage. The regime had weapons. That is often the decisive fact. A dictatorship does not collapse merely because the population dislikes it. It collapses when the armed institutions stop defending it, when elites split, when the treasury can no longer pay, or when the state suffers a military or administrative breakdown. As long as Putin can pay the security forces, a mass uprising remains unlikely. People sometimes say, but there are 140 million of them. The police cannot arrest everyone. This is mathematically true and politically meaningless. People do not act as one coordinated body. Each person must decide whether to step forward without knowing whether millions of others will do the same. The first protesters face the greatest danger. If everyone joins them, they may succeed. If everyone waits, the first group is crushed. Authoritarian systems survive by making people doubt one another. A Russian may hate Putin but assume her neighbor supports him. The neighbor may think exactly the same about her. Neither speaks. This is not admirable, but it is predictable. Alexei Navalny briefly showed that a different form of political organization was possible. Starting with investigations into corruption, he built regional networks, attracted volunteers, and created something close to a genuine anti-elite movement. The Kremlin learned from that experience. Navalny was poisoned, imprisoned, and eventually died in custody. His organizations were declared extremist. Associates were persecuted or forced abroad. Donations, reposts, and participation became evidence in criminal cases. The state did not merely punish the opposition leader. It destroyed the organizational infrastructure that might have turned private discontent into collective action. Without organization, anger remains private, and private anger does not overthrow governments. The guilty, the complicit, and the silent. So, where should the moral line be drawn? Anyone who actually supported the war bears responsibility for that choice. Some did so cynically because it brought money, status, influence, or career opportunities. Propagandists who called for Ukrainian cities to be destroyed, officials who organized repression and mobilization, informers who denounced their neighbors, and soldiers and commanders who committed crimes were not passive participants. They made decisions and should be judged for them. This is precisely why collective guilt is so dangerous. It allows those people to disappear into the crowd. If every Russian is considered equally guilty by birth or citizenship, then the propagandist and the frightened pensioner occupy the same moral category. The official who sends others to die becomes no more responsible than someone who withdrew from public life and tried to survive. That is not justice. It is a refusal to distinguish between choices. There is also another group, those who supported the war because they refused to think. After years of destruction, they still repeat that Russia had no choice, that Ukraine attacked first, that every murdered civilian was a stage performance, or that any crime became acceptable if the United States once committed something similar. They are not necessarily cynical. Some genuinely believe what they say, but a person also has a responsibility to use reason. When evidence accumulates, refusing to examine it becomes a moral choice. At some point, stupidity stops being innocent. Silence alone does not make a person guilty. Someone who withdrew from public life, refused to support the war, and tried simply to survive should not be treated as though he helped launch the invasion. He may have chosen safety over resistance, but passivity is not the same as complicity, and cowardice is not the same as criminal responsibility. A society may bear a broader responsibility to confront what was done in its name. That does not erase the differences between those who designed the war, those who promoted it, those who carried it out, and those who had little real power to influence events. Moral judgment must take account of choice, knowledge, opportunity, and power. The greater a person's ability to affect events, and the more deliberately that power was used for harm, the greater the responsibility. Without those distinctions, morality loses its connection to human action. The danger of collective blame. There is another reason to reject collective guilt. It can help create the next war. After the First World War, many Germans came to believe that their country had been condemned as uniquely evil and forced to carry responsibility for a catastrophe produced by several empires. This sense of humiliation did not automatically create Nazism. Germany's collapse, political violence, economic crisis, anti-Semitism, and elite decisions all mattered. But Hitler understood how to use the feeling of collective injustice. He told Germans that they had been betrayed, falsely accused, and humiliated by outsiders. He transformed wounded pride into political energy. The message was powerful because it offered moral absolution. You are not guilty, he told them. You are the victim. When entire populations are condemned without distinction, nationalists gain an opportunity. They present themselves as defenders of dignity against an unfair world. The same danger exists with Russia. Imagine a generation of Russian children growing up with the message that they are permanently stained by crimes committed before they could vote, speak, or understand politics. Some will reject Russian imperialism. Others will respond, if the world hates us regardless of what we do, then we might as well become strong enough to frighten it. That is how collective punishment can feed revanchism. The goal after this war should not be to make Russians feel eternally humiliated. It should be to dismantle the institutions, myths, and incentives that made the invasion possible. Russia must abandon imperial claims. War criminals must face justice. Propagandists, officials, commanders, and collaborators should be judged according to their actions. The state must acknowledge what was done to Ukraine and accept responsibility for reconstruction. But these goals require individual and institutional accountability, not hereditary guilt. There is a difference between saying Russia committed this crime and saying every Russian is equally guilty of it. A state acts through institutions. Those institutions can be investigated, punished, reformed, and replaced. And ethnicity or nationality cannot. Choosing civilization. I believe this war is part of a larger struggle between civilization and barbarism. By civilization, I do not mean that one nation is naturally superior to another. I mean a system in which law stands above rulers. Evidence matters more than myth, and responsibility is attached to individual actions. Barbarism judges by category. It says that a person is guilty because of his ancestry, passport, language, class, or tribe. That was the logic of Genghis Khan, Stalin, and Hitler. Entire populations could be deported, punished, or destroyed because they were treated as one collective body. The democratic idea is the opposite. A civilized legal order asks what a particular person did, what that person knew, what power he possessed, and what alternatives were realistically available. That standard may feel emotionally unsatisfying during a war. It is much easier to say that they were all guilty. But civilization is often emotionally unsatisfying. A court requires evidence when the crowd already feels certain. A constitution protects unpopular people. Individual rights restrain revenge. That restraint is not weakness, it is the foundation of a society in which none of us can be punished simply for belonging to the wrong group. I will never be friends with people who support the invasion of Ukraine. I find their position morally repellent, but I will not condemn every Russian indiscriminately. That would reproduce the same tribal logic I oppose. My goal is not to protect Russian pride. My goal is to see Russia become a peaceful, democratic, prosperous country that no longer threatens its neighbors. I want a Russia without political castes, where a small ruling group cannot seize national wealth and then distract the population with stories about enemies and greatness. I want Russia to stop behaving like an empire and learn to exist as one country among many. The people who live there are not going to disappear. They will continue raising children, working, building homes, forming relationships, and trying to create decent lives. The question is what political culture those lives will produce. Collective guilt pushes people back into defensive nationalism. Individual accountability offers another path. Before you go, I'd like to ask you a difficult but personal question. Imagine that you lived under a dictatorship where speaking openly could cost you your job, your freedom, or your family's safety. At what point would silence become complicity for you? Would responsibility begin when a person privately understands that the war is criminal, but saying nothing? When they repeat propaganda to avoid trouble? When they benefit from the system? Or only when they actively help it harm others? Please tell me, where would you draw the line? If this episode gave you a new way to think about Russian collective guilt, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who may disagree. Thoughtful disagreement is especially valuable on a subject this difficult. You can also help keep this channel independent by joining my think tank, leaving a super thanks, supporting through PayPal, or using your hype points to help this episode reach more viewers. And please follow the show on Spotify. It genuinely helps, and the next episode will appear in your feed automatically. Russia must answer for what it did to Ukraine. But justice does not mean assigning equal guilt to everyone with the same passport. It means making responsibility precise enough that the guilty cannot hide inside the crowd, and the innocent are not condemned with them. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.